It's going to be such a great pleasure to talk with our guest this morning, Dr. Mark Clarfield. And we're going to talk about the challenges of ageing in low and middle income countries. So Mark is currently Emeritus Professor of Geriatrics, Faculty of Health Sciences, Ben Gurion University in Israel. Now, our paths have crossed through friends and colleagues from Toronto, where Mark received an MD from the University of Toronto and specialised firstly in family medicine, then public health, and finally in geriatrics. And Mark and I met at Baycrest just this week. I'm on the board of Baycrest, and Mark will tell you a little bit about his involvement in Baycrest. But after Toronto, Mark moved to Montreal, where he became the first Chief of Geriatrics at the Jewish General Hospital, as well as head of the McGill University Geriatrics Division. And through his teaching, he still maintains an adjunct status at McGill. Well, that was terribly unhelpful, so my apologies. Because the introduction I gave you, Mark, was fantastic. So, you did lots of things in Toronto.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Montreal, and did a lot more things, and then you were in Israel, but welcome. And we're connected through friends and colleagues, and the world is very small, particularly in the field of ageing. So it's good to have you in Toronto and to be our expert in the Global Cafe. So let's move into, my first curiosity. So in 2021, you authored a paper that was entitled Portrait of the Golfer as an Old Man, Losing the Long Game. And just in the opening paragraph, you used the phrase adding life to years. And it was in the context of a story. You're a great storyteller. It was in the context of a story about complex health decisions that your father was making at the time. The question to you is, as a son and a geriatrician, how did your father navigate the decision making, and for what benefit? Because I think in that story, you unpack a lot of decisions that we make as individuals, but systems make as well.
Right. Well, first of all, good morning and good afternoon and evening to you all, and thank you so much for inviting me. I see there are a lot of people on the screen, and I'm grateful that you asked me to speak this morning, to chat with you, really, not to speak. But, this is the general question of how does a doctor, which I am, how do you navigate your family? How do you navigate the illnesses in your family? And what I tried to do, but didn't always succeed, was to find my parents in particular, and my children, when they were young. I tried not to look after my family members, but when your parents get old, and my dad died when he was 100, my mother 93, there are decisions and things that happen. What I did do, and I see even on the screen this morning, I found them the best doctors in the world, one of whom is on the screen today, Michael Gordon from Baycrest, who is a geriatrician, a friend, a teacher, my mentor. And he and other people like him looked after my parents. And that being said, my father would call me, I would speak to him weekly, and he would always have a medical question. And I'd say, well, what did Dr. Gordon say? Or what did Dr. Sinovich say? Or what did Dr. So? I knew who his doctors were, and I had an open dialogue with them. And I tried to push off decisions and questions to his healthcare workers. But that doesn't always work, and it doesn't work on weekends, and it doesn't work on nights. It's not easy. It's really, the sandwich generation is a tough thing to go through, particularly if you're fortunate. And whenever I got frustrated or had difficulty, I thank God I still had my parents. I mean, I had my dad into my 70s, and I wasn't the youngest child in the family. So it's a tough road for any doctor or any healthcare worker to navigate with their family, especially as people get old. But again, get the best healthcare workers you can and try and hand over, insofar as one can, to them.
So, Mark, your father made a fairly important decisions about surgery quite late in his life. And he seems as though he had a wonderful sense of humour, because he kind of used the Monty Python, I'm
not dead. I'm not dead yet.
I'm not dead yet. But what was the thinking that he had to go through to decide no surgery? Because first of all, he said, we'll let nature take its course. But then it seems that he actually changed that. So what was that, and what was it like being a geriatrician to see
Right.
this?
Well, this was for the doctors among you, was endovascular surgery to replace an abdominal aortic aneurysm. And at first he said, "Oh, I'm not." It was 97. He said, "I don't, this isn't bothering me. It'll kill me one day. I'll die quickly." Finished. I said, "Well, Dad, that's a legitimate decision." He said, "On the other hand, I could have surgery, and I could just walk away from the table because the doctors say that usually it goes very well." And after discussing with him over a few weeks, and he talked to his doctors, I know, he decided not to have the surgery. And I said, "Well, Dad, that's a legitimate decision, and you'll probably die with this aneurysm and not of it, but it could kill you. You have to know that." He was quite brave and open about all of his decisions. And then one day I got a phone call. I was in Israel, and he called me from Toronto, and he said, I'm going for surgery in 3 days." I said, "What?" He said, "I'm going for I said, "Well, Daddy, what changed your mind?" He said, "I found out that I wasn't allowed to drive with this aneurysm unrepaired. And my father was 97 and driving, and he drove until 2 weeks. So his decision was based entirely on whether he could drive or not, which brings up the point, of course, that most old people want to keep their independence. And was it safe for him to drive? And the answer is no, but it was never safe for him to drive. He was a terrible driver. And he was a terrible driver when he was 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. But he wasn't a more terrible driver because he was old. So he never killed anybody. He never killed himself. And he died with his aneurysm repaired 3 years later. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, look, I had a father who was quite a terrible driver too. He didn't seem to understand the concept of roundabouts.
Yeah.
He seemed to sort of, want to sort of swerve through them.
Yeah.
Across your career as a geriatrician, how have you seen your role as not only the diagnostician, but also, in some areas, really trying to understand the mental health needs of older people? How has that changed? Because, you've been a clinician for a long time.
Well, look, we deal with sort of, in geriatrics, we deal with three major mental health issues. One is delirium, which is a nice one to deal with because you can sometimes succeed in dealing with it and raising the knowledge of people that this is not a sudden onset of Alzheimer's disease, that people have a medical illness and should be treated vigorously. The second one is depression. And I've had a lot of clinical satisfaction in undercovering people with depression who've had all kinds of somatic symptoms for 30 or 40 years, and the diagnosis was never made. People said it's your stomach, and it's your joints, and it's your back, and it's your this, and it was depression. So that was also a lot of fun and gratifying to diagnose and treat, because like many things in older people, it didn't necessarily present itself typically. It presented we say that there's atypical presentation in the elderly. It's not atypical for old people, it's just atypical for young people. It's just different, but that's fun. The big disappointment over the years for me has been Alzheimer's disease. Disappointment in the sense that, and I have a kind of radical position on this, I like to say to my students, there are often two schools of thought on a difficult issue, mine and the wrong one. And I'll present you with mine, and that is that none of the drugs for cognition do anything, or they hardly do anything. And so we spend a huge amount of time giving out drugs that cause side effects, that raise people's expectations. And I know the answer from my colleagues is, well, what else do we have? And I think we have other things. We do have other ways to treat this. So that's a big disappointment, although I know the basic science of Alzheimer's and the related dementias is amazing. But what we know now compared to when I was a student back in the day at Baycrest, we know so much more. So we will find a solution to this disease, but we haven't yet. And I think we should be more frank with the public and more frank with our patients that we really don't have good drugs to deal with this disease, but there are other things that one can do.
And I think also that the propaganda, the dialogue around Alzheimer versus dementia, I think that there's a lot of confusion in the public space. So people can have cognitive decline, but there are so many kinds of dementia, outside of that which is diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, but the majority of dementia is a syndrome. It's not a disease. It's going to be caused by many diseases, of which Alzheimer's is the most common. And you do have to make sure you're dealing with that, because even though there isn't a treatment for the other ones, or Alzheimer's itself, they have different courses and different prognoses, and some of them have more behavioral. So you do have to, be skillful in distinguishing among the different causes that bring about the dementia syndrome. But the big one is Alzheimer's. That's the most common around the world, and it's the most common, wherever you look.
And that's why we need geriatricians who are skilled in the diagnosis.
Right.
I want to, before we go on to your work in Ethiopia, I want to just get your perspectives around long-term care. Now, WHO talk about long-term care as from services into the home, where someone can be, reasonably stable with their function, all the way through to acute and long-term care. So you've traveled the world. What's your thoughts about where the whole evolution of long-term care is going? So, for example, in Ontario, there was big announcement about more beds. We need more beds for nursing homes. I'm of the opinion that's not the way to go.
Yeah.
But what's your sense of how the world is viewing older age and residential care?
Well, it depends. You have to divide the world into the rich world and the poor world on this one, because in the poor world, there are almost no institutions for frail patients that need institutionalization. In every country, there are people that cannot be looked after by their family. There's people that don't have families. A significant minority of older people don't have families, or their families are far away and they get old and frail. They can't look after themselves, and home care services, which can do a wonderful job, are overwhelmed. So every country needs a minimum number of institutions for long-term care, for ongoing care, for people that cannot be looked after for the various reasons and different countries have a different attitude to long-term care. So take where I live in Israel. We have a relatively small percentage of our old people in institutions compared to, say, Canada. Canada probably has double the percentage, the ratio per capita, per old person in institutions. And the question is, why is that? And we don't seem to have all kinds of old people wandering the streets looking for long-term care in institutions. One of the things is how well organized the community services are, because the better they're organized, the fewer long-term care beds you need. The second is the attitude of family and cultural issues. So where I live, the country is 80% Jewish and 20% Muslim. Both of those cultures have a strong, long-standing, 1,000-year-old view that children have to look after their parents. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone does, but the general culture is such that it's expected. And then in Israel, for example, they made a very wise decision 30 years ago. Probably our mutual friend Yitzhak Rick was involved in this decision, and that is to invest in sufficient number of home care so they could keep the number of long-term care beds down. So government has to pitch in and make laws and policies that support the family but do not supplant the family. And you see, wherever you go in the world, you'll see some kind of different combination of services based on history, based on the literature, based on political expediency, based on the wisdom or lack thereof of the political and medical leaders. And there are a million models, but you need enough. Basically, you need enough long-term beds for those people that the community services can't look after, but the community services and family should be supported in a wise and a policy intelligent way.
Look, thank you for that. And before we move on to your work in Ethiopia and LMICs, your good friend and colleague would like to take issue with your comment about treatment. So I'm going to ask Dr. Michael Gordon to just be off mic.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Michael. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I told you I'd get up at 7 o'clock. I've been up since 4 because that's when my wife gets up to start her walking and exercises and swimming, and the cats come and wake me up. Anyway, I have to take issue with your comments on cholinesterase inhibitors. I mean, nothing cures, but they do as well as some other drugs that we use for other diseases. And I've had a very remarkable experience with them over the years, including my late father. And when there's very little else to offer, and you have a possibility, as I've seen, for quite remarkable responses, I generally use it. I've just started working again in a memory clinic, and I must say that thus far, I have had quite a lot of beneficial outcomes if you choose the right person. You have to make sure you don't choose them too early and you don't choose them too late, and you have to know how to dose them. I find that most doctors start with doses that are far too high, and then people have side effects and they stop. And I start with the really old go lows, start low, go slow. I start very low and go very slow. And I must say, I have to disagree with you on that. And the Canadian Consensus Conference on Dementia, I was on the last committee. It was recommended that this be one of the drugs that we try in patients with whichever you want, Cochrane or somebody else, 20, 30, 40% response.
Yeah.
Sorry to
Okay.
disagree with you,
Well,
Mark.
thanks for that comment, Michael. And Michael Gordon was my teacher and mentor and now friend, and I take what he says very seriously. But I said there are two schools of thought, mine and the wrong one. And Michael's not wrong. Of course, I prescribe the drugs, but I reduce the exuberance in which I do so, and I'm only speaking, Michael, to the promises that I've seen many of our colleagues give patients, and I think your comment helps. Of course, you should try the drugs, but be honest about what they can and can't do, and be quick to discontinue them when they cause more harm than good. That was all. But you'll agree with me that we're still in the pre-antibiotic era of Alzheimer's disease, that we don't have penicillin for Alzheimer's, and you've said that, and I agree with you.
Yeah, no, but we do have sulfur.
We do. Well, I know. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
All right.
All
Okay.
right. Thanks for the comment.
Good luck.
It's always good to have vigorous discussion at 7 a.m. in the morning. Look, Michael, I want to take a bit of a 90-degree turn and refer to another one of your writings, and that is entitled "The Ones We Seldom See, Old Folks in Young Countries." And all of these articles are going to be made available on the IFA website. And it's really about your work and your commitment to training and educating healthcare professionals in sub-Saharan Africa. When we met in Baycrest just this week, you talked about a sabbatical that you and your wife had in Ethiopia, and it was both very difficult but also enlightening, and seems to have become almost part of the next phase of your life journey. Could you talk a little bit about your sabbatical, and then we'll unpack a little bit more of your work in Ethiopia?
Sure. Well, I won't take thank you for that question. I won't take the time to give the background to why I know something about Ethiopia, but I did indeed spend 4 months there with my wife, who's a hematologist oncologist. And we have our medical schools have a connection with a site in Ethiopia. So we said, sabbatical time, we've been to sub-Saharan Africa. We've been to East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. We said, let's go to the fourth East African country, Ethiopia, which is in fact very different from the other three. And we really had a life-changing time there. It's a beautiful country. It's a fascinating country, historically, ethnically, cuisine-wise, geographically, geologically, musically. The music's spectacular there. But it's among the poorest countries in the world. And so I've been to poor countries. I've seen poor people. I know how difficult it is for them, especially when they get sick. But this was a whole other level of suffering that we saw, in the sense that the doctors there are extremely well trained. They've got good medical schools there. The doctors we met knew everything that I knew. Now, maybe that's not such a big compliment. They knew everything that Dr. Gordon knew. I mean, they really knew a lot, and they were knowledgeable, and they knew how to diagnose. They were very good. They are very good clinicians. And the trouble is that because the resources are so scant, it's very difficult to do curative treatment for not everybody, but for many people. So that you have to, when you go there, you have to kind of get ready for that. And it was worse or more telling than in other poor countries I've been to. But I went there because I know that there are old people everywhere, in every country, and we tend to sort of brush off low-income countries as gerontologically uninteresting because they have, quote, very few old people. Well, they have relatively few old people, but absolutely they have many old people. So right now, 60% of people over age 60 in the world live in LMICs, low and middle income countries. Most old people live in poor countries. And most rich countries got rich before they got old. And most poor countries are still poor as they're aging. They have a real problem because they're not prepared in any way for this growth, this absolute growth of the number of old people. Because as I said, these people are hiding in the denominator of millions and millions and hundreds of millions of children. I spoke to a student of mine who's a mid-career doctor. He's taking his master's in public health at the Hebrew University where I teach in Jerusalem. And he's taking my course on aging. And he came up to me and said, Prof, you know, people, they like to call you Prof from different countries, which I don't say no to. Prof, you've opened my eyes. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I work in a refugee camp, and refugee camps have even lower percentages of old people than the rest of the country, but they do have old people. And he said, we have old people in the refugee camp. He said, you know what I used to do when we saw old people sick? Well, he was a doctor. I said, what? He said, I walked around them. We would walk around the sick old people. One, because we didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to look after them. And two, because we had all these children to look after. So I said, well, at least with respect to the many children, of course we have to look after them. But I hope after this course and other things, you'll now be more skilled in trying to help old people, because it doesn't always take a lot to make them feel better. Sometimes it does. But I saw thousands and thousands of old people who were undertreated, undiagnosed, unrecognized, even as potential patients because of this mindset of a low percentage. But that's changing. So for example, China and other countries, India to a lesser extent, are in a terrible panic because they're entering the demographic transition unready, untaught. The medical schools teach nothing about, or almost nothing about aging in all of the Ethiopian schools. India, they do start to teach some. China's beginning to teach, but it's a huge number of people with, and they suffer, of course, like here, like in rich countries, from NCDs, non-communicable diseases. So 50% of the deaths today in Ethiopia are caused by NCDs, non-communicable diseases, 50%. In Canada, it's 85, 90% of death or cause. And you have to die of something, and you can die of old age too. But if you want to attach a label to it, half the people in Ethiopia die, and the top 5 causes of death in Ethiopia are among the top 5: ischemic heart disease, stroke, and cancer, just like Canada. And yet the doctors there and the systems there are not skilled and ready to look after these people. Not to speak of them, they don't even, you know, they don't. Michael Gordon and my debate about whether to treat or not to treat is moot there because the diagnosis isn't made. Sometimes people think, you know, as we used to think in Canada too, and other rich countries, something's gone, it's aging, or they have a screw loose, or a witch they've been cursed. So it's a real issue, and it's something that fascinates me. I don't know, you know, why does someone become a dentist or an airplane pilot? Because they want to. So I was just interested in old people in general as a geriatrician. And when I went into poor countries, I found an even more interesting story, if one can imagine that. I hope that helps, Jane. I sort of went off on a tangent.
No, it all helps to provide context. But, you know, Mark and also Dr. Gordon, you've been really at the forefront of policy change too. You know, you've been talking with government and trying to convince them about the importance of environments and medication, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to put you in Ethiopia.
Right.
Because Ethiopia, as with many countries, have national strategies on aging, right?
Right.
And we're all in the decade of healthy aging.
Right.
But how do we operationalize a national aging strategy when the country is poor economically and has fewer older people relative to the population?
Right.
So I plant that question, and then I'm going to have a question about rights.
Okay.
So what are your thoughts about that?
Right. So you're right. I mean, I'm sort of an informal advisor to the Ministry of Health in Ethiopia. They do have a very well written and thoughtful plan for healthy aging, which when you read it, you say, "Whoa, this is terrific. Let's go." And then, of course, it doesn't go anywhere. Why doesn't it go anywhere? Because the main reason, you'd think the main reason is budget, and of course, budget is a main reason, but it's not the main reason, because anything can start with a low budget. You just have to pick what you can do with that low budget. And I advised them, I said, look, you've got a 35-year plan here. You have to start working on it. Pick some priorities. For example, when I was in Ethiopia back in 2018, they launched an NCD, a non-communicable disease national plan. And in order to launch it, they had a national meeting. They brought people from across the country to Addis. People presented, the media was there, the deans were there, et cetera, et cetera. And one would hope that from that particular launch, the national plan for NCDs would get going, and it did get going. How successful, I don't know. But I told them they need a national meeting to kick this national plan off. And then they have to invest, and it's a big country and it's a poor country, but it does have money. It does have some money. All countries have money. They have to find a couple of champions. They have to find a couple of young doctors who have studied either family medicine or internal medicine and say, you are going to be the pioneers of geriatrics in Ethiopia. We're going to send you to Canada or England or Israel or whatever, and you're going to spend 2 years training, and we're going to attach you to a mentor, someone like myself or Michael Gordon or someone else, and say, they're going to accompany you for the next 5 years and help you build services. I remember when I was a young geriatrician, I went to Scotland to study, and that's where Michael studied medicine. But Scotland at the time, and still is, had very good geriatric services. And I spent a month with Professor James Williamson at City Hospital in Edinburgh. Sadly, he died a number of years ago. And he had a wonderful set of services. And I said, Professor Williamson, it's so enlightening to be here, but it's a bit depressing. He said, what? He said, why is that, Mark? I said, well, I haven't got anything near what you have here. He said, look, he said, it took me 30 years to organize these services. So I said, oh, 30 years, okay. Here I am, 40 years later, I spent my whole life organizing services. You have to start somewhere. But champions, I told them they needed actually 4. They needed 2 Jane Barrett and Yitzhak Bricks, and 2 Michael Gordons and Mark Clarfields. They needed 2 geriatricians and 2 gerontologists to kind of kick off and get involved in the universities and start a journal and have a meeting. And there's a lot of goodwill. There's a lot of Jane Barretts and Michael Gordons and Mark Clarfields who are very happy to come and help out for free. But it has to start there. I can't organize their services. I can help them to start them. I can advise them. I can be a mentor, but they have to. And they said they're doing this. So I have a meeting in July. I've met with the Ministry of Health once. I'm meeting with them again. I'm pushing them in this direction. If they want to take my advice, great. If not, I'll go on more IFA cafes. I don't know.
That sounds good to me. Look, Mark, I now want to, and I'm going to pull Margaret Gillis into this conversation. Yeah. And it's about rights. You know, you may or may not know that for now nearly 12 years, there's been conversations, dialogue with member states and civil society around, the feasibility of a UN convention on the rights of older people. And Margaret Gillis, in her own right, has been leading, and driving, NGOs in this country, but also around the world in understanding how we as civil society can advocate. So I'm going to ask Margaret just to ask a question about rights and African Union and Africa, because, and I know I've put you on the spot, Margaret, but you can do this. Because I just want Mark to hear, the information that you have, Margaret.
Yeah, great.
Well, I think, Mark, just listening to you this morning, it's funny, it sort of perked in my head that there's a really big connection to the work that you're doing and to rights. Yesterday, we had for a World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, we had a little conference where Bob Ray spoke, and he, of course, is the ambassador to the UN for Canada. And one of the things he said is because he was asked, why is there resistance to a convention? And he said, because it forces change. And when you're talking about making change in terms of how we react to people living with Alzheimer's, we have to think of that work in the context of rights. And I also think all of the work that you do in the medical field needs to be seen through the rights of the patient. So there's a really interesting combination here. As we push for human rights for older persons, I think one of the things we need to think about is that whole concept of right to health, and how does that play out, particularly with practitioners when it's someone like you who's on the front lines, but also in terms of how we think about the people you're serving. So I guess the question have you in your work thought about that? I mean, you sort of do it innately from what I'm hearing from you, but I think it's a really interesting new movement that's happening to think about how we deliver services as rights.
Yeah. I'll be happy to answer that. I think when I was in Ethiopia, I gave a talk to the public health doctors who were quite separate from the clinical doctors, which happens here too. But and one of them, the Ethiopians are extremely polite. The medical culture is extremely polite. And I saw this poor guy was sort of afraid to ask. He looked like he was reticent or afraid to ask me a question. Like I said, go ahead. He said, well, I don't want to insult you. I said, no, any question is fine, please. And he asked a really good question. He said, look, I hear what you're saying about old people. We know that there are old people in Ethiopia, but we are so inundated by care of children and maternal and child health care that I have to ask you, Professor Clarfield, isn't it immoral to look after, to concentrate on old people, and we have so much unmet need of children? I said, I didn't go into the whole, philosophical business of equal rights because I didn't have time for that. But I said, look, I understand where you're coming from. I said, but wouldn't we solve this problem if Ethiopia had a universal health care service, even if it wasn't a rich service? If there was a basket of services for everybody, and that's the way to go, I think, with rights, medical rights. I think if you try and do medical rights for old people, the Americans did this. Tell me, why is there Medicare in the United States? There should be Medicare. Why is there free medical care for people over age 65? It's terrific. They should have free medical care for everybody. So I think that in the rights, and I'm no expert in this. You have to ask our friend Issy Doron, who you probably know, Margaret, and he's more of an expert in this. But I'll tell you that the rights, I think maybe it's not the medical rights that are most important, it's the social rights. So I don't know if it's still the case in Uganda, but a couple of years ago, I wrote an article about a case report from Uganda, a woman who when her husband died, lost their land to her brothers and had no legal recourse to this. So I don't want to put Uganda on the spot because maybe they changed the laws. But the general laws surrounding people, I think, are one of the ways we need to go. If all women can inherit the land or property of their deceased husband, then you solve a lot of problems, and you solve the problems of older people. It's not that can all old ladies inherit. Can anyone who is married inherit the joint property and doesn't go to some in-law? So clearly we have a road to go. Look what's happening in France, Margaret. I'm interested in what you think there. President Macron, in my view, is right. He's correct in pushing up the pensionable age in France. And Israel has among one of the oldest pensionable ages. And I think the older you make this, the better, especially for old women who live longer and could be left destitute. So we have some problems in that society is speaking out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, we want rights for older people. On the other hand, we don't want people to work into old age. And that to me is a critical thing that we all should do. Work as long as we can. I'm not saying we should. Not talking a man who's doing physical labor, a woman who's bent over a loom should work into her 80s. But we've got problems that I think large part of the problem has to do with general rights, like land, for example, or healthcare. but of course I wouldn't be against if there were a declaration of human rights for old people. I wouldn't be against it because old people do have their own special challenges. I agree with that. I don't know if that Margaret, you want to respond or agree?
No, I mean, I guess there's a couple of things in there. I think you've made a really wonderful explanation of the need for the social determinants of health and the connection to health and social determinants. And of course, that's always part of rights. So, you're not going to be healthy if you don't have a place to live or proper food. We know all that. Those are all, and I think that is always part of rights. And when you look at how rights treaties are written, they reflect that kind of thing. They talk about housing, they talk about right to food, they talk about right to medicine. So that's all connected in. Just in terms of your comment on France, anything around the changing to pension systems needs to be looked at in a more particular way. And I'll give you an example why. Canada was going to move the pensionable age up to 67 a few years ago. And when there was research done, it knocked a whole bunch of older women into extreme poverty. So I think the thing is, when you make those decisions, you need to be looking at how you can mitigate other impacts. So part of that is you have to study it. So I don't know that I would want to comment totally on France without knowing a little bit more about what would happen. So that's the only thing. I'm not saying yes or no. I think you just have to think about what's happening in the population when you make decisions and who gets impacted.
Sure. There's winners and losers with every policy change. There are winners and losers, and it has to be nuanced. I agree. But I see, Jane, I see that one of my colleagues from Ethiopia is asking questions. Abi, who works with he's the referent. I don't know how you say that in English. He's the lead on aging in the Ministry of Health. Abi, are you there? I saw some comments that he made.
Yeah, there's lots of comments.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm glad to see Mike. There he is.
I'm just listening. I'm just listening.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Abi. Great to see your name there.
Okay.
And thank you, Abi. You put some notes in the chat box, and you're welcome.
Yeah, sure.
You're welcoming people to contact you. So thank you very much.
Great. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Mark,
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mark, we have Shmuel is one of our cafe attendees every week. So he's asked a particular question about, to what degree is it the responsibility of high-income countries to support lower-income countries, in the development of healthy aging programs?
Well, look, I'm a card-carrying socialist. I'm not a communist. I'm a socialist. I do believe that we have to share the wealth, and without going too far into the decolonialization argument and things like that, a lot of Western countries got rich. Britain would be a good example. Canada less so, though we colonized our own country, but that's another story. I think that from an historical point of view, wealthy countries have a debt to pay of some sort. It shouldn't be so outrageous that the world is turned upside down. I just read that in Britain, I don't know if there are any Brits on the line, Britain just stopped paying in 2015 for it compensated slave owners in 1822 when it outlawed slavery in the British Empire, Empire, of course. So these things go back a long, long, long way. And I think that we owe it to poorer people as poor people, just like in Canada. We owe rich people in Canada should help old people. It should help poor people. It's, to me, it's like part of my DNA. Rich countries should help poor countries. I don't have to tell you about COVID and other reasons, but that's a selfish reason. We want to help them so they don't affect us. I don't really like that argument so much, but it is true. I think that an unhealthy world is a poor world. A poor world is an unstable world, and war everywhere destabilizes everything, as we can see, of course, with the atrocities in the Ukraine. But that's not a poor country. I think we just owe it. I think rich people owe poor people some help. You don't have to divide everything up equally, because that's communism. We know it doesn't work, but socialism does work. And people in socialist countries like Canada or Israel or the Scandinavia, they tend to be happier than people in less socialist and socialized countries.
Look, I think that's a really comprehensive response. I also do think that, if we're going to invest, as appropriately we should as countries that are high income, we need to follow through. And I think the COVID pandemic, showed good, bad, and ugly,
Right.
in that respect.
Right.
But Mark, I want to now go on and discuss your relationship with Joni Mitchell, one of the most influential singer-songwriters to emerge from the 1960s.
Right.
And you're part of a band, so I want to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah.
But in your article, Joni Mitchell and Me, My Heart and Her Brain, such a poignant article where you trace your love and her love of music. But in doing so, you really talked about the impact of the brain aneurysm that she had, but really the important relationships that actually continue to surround her, to uphold her respect and dignity for herself and the music. So I'd just like you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I'll give a little background for people on the screen that don't know Joni Mitchell. She's a famous jazz and folk singer, Canadian, lives in California, I think, and has written some of the most beautiful songs and performed some of the most gorgeous music in the world for me. Unfortunately, a few years ago, she had some, and I'm speaking from the public record. I never examined her. I don't know her. I'm not her doctor, but in the public record, and she talks about it. She had an aneurysm. She had a bleeding aneurysm in her head, and she was quite unwell. She became paralyzed. She couldn't talk. She couldn't sing. She couldn't play guitar. And as happens with bleeds, if they don't kill you, sometimes the prognosis isn't as bad as some stroke. So she has recovered enormously from that due to her good luck, due to hard work. I think she had good physio and she probably did it. But she came back on stage at the Newport Jazz Festival in July, just about a year ago. And it was a great miracle because it was Lazarus Rising. I mean, here you had, this woman who had, this legend of music who had struck down by illness. We thought we'd never hear from her again. We'd never see her perform. And she taught herself how to play guitar and by watching her own YouTubes, which I think is one of the most miraculous musical stories I've ever heard. And she got up and played an instrumental fast train, which I couldn't. I'm a guitarist, and I couldn't play it as well as she played it on that YouTube. But she didn't play it as well as she used to play it, which is no big surprise, and it's because of her illness. Now, maybe she'll overcome it. I mean, she's such a talented person, and she's practicing and working so hard. She's coming back, but she didn't come back fully musically to the musical ear. But that's the sad part. That the inspiring part is, of course, she came back at all, and she can still sing. Her voice is not what it used to be, but then older women's voices do deteriorate, as do older men. Older women's voices deteriorate more quickly, unfortunately, than older men's voices. But she can still sing. But what was really heartening is if you watch the videos, you'll see younger musicians fluttering around her, helping her on stage, singing along with her, not overwhelming her. In other words, not taking over the stage and not taking over the song, singing harmony with her, letting her voice come out strong and first. And also the thing I wrote in the article, which was really touching, was, when you sing, you have a microphone, and you have to, if you don't sing right into a microphone, sometimes your voice will be lost. So you have to know how to use a mic. And she looked like the microphone wasn't really approaching her mouth. And so one of her friends, Brandy, I forget her last name, one of the musicians, just leaned over and just moved it up, which I thought was such a beautiful gesture and so symbolic of how a younger person can help an older person with a very, very small, subtle, you'd only notice it if you're a musician, knowing that about microphones. It didn't take over the stage. You have to look to see it. But it was a beautiful example of a love of younger musicians for this iconic older singer, songwriter, pianist, guitarist.
Yeah, we'll move to a not so uplifting story from that of Joni Mitchell.
Right.
And I want to talk about, wars and man-made disasters. And in another article, you talked about in wars, there are always many wrongs, often on both sides, but the worst is to deny food and medical care to innocent civilians anywhere. Right. And from a bird's eye view, how does war give rise to medical catastrophes against the background of human tragedy? And what do we do, me sitting in my warm shelter in Toronto? There's one thing about giving money, right? But what is it that we need to do as human beings? Recognizing, but not living that experience.
Yeah, well, I unfortunately live in a bit of a war zone, so I've done it from the comfort of Canada and the discomfort of wars in Israel. Ethiopia just went through a civil war that we hope is over. And the Ukrainian disaster is happening before our eyes. So first of all, let's just connect old people to war for a second, or natural disasters as a general topic, of which war is a terrible but large subset. We know that older people and small children suffer the most from any natural disaster, be it a flood, a storm, a forest fire, or a war. So sometimes you can plan for things. So for example, Cuba has hurricanes like the rest of the Caribbean. But when they have hurricanes in Cuba, they know they're coming, and they know where their dialysis patients are, and they know where their homebound patients are, and they march in and they find them and they put them in a shelter before the hurricane hits. So when you can plan, you should plan. But war, there are no words for war. I mean, I've been in war and I've seen the results of war. War is simply a negation of anything human that we're talking about today. And the way that we can contribute is, of course, go in and help out. And I did my best to help my friends in Mekelle, which is in Tigray province in Ethiopia during war, by raising people's knowledge about the suffering. Did I, Mark Clarfield, and my friends who signed letters of protest, did we bring the peace treaty closer? I'd like to think I have that kind of influence. The answer is probably no. But we did make our friends feel that they weren't forgotten. And that's very important when people are in a disaster area, be it war or flood, to know you're not forgotten and that someone cares about you and someone's trying to help you, helps you hang on. With respect to something like war, I think that the Ukraine disaster is a good example. There's no reason why any liberal country should not support the Ukrainians against the Russians. And I see politicians, right-wing politicians, talking about whether we've given enough help and it's money down the drain. Canada should do everything in its power to help the Ukrainians, be it through arms, be it through sending food supplies, ammunition. I'm not a warmonger, but sometimes when you're up against the Nazis, you have to have D-Day. And when you're up against the Russians, you have to help the Ukrainians. And they've actually gotten a lot of help. I think what's happened in Ukraine, unlike many other wars in the world, people have rallied around. But I think we could rally around even more. We could be stricter with Russians, Russian interests, not Russian people, Russian interests. We should ensure that Russian interests have no place in Canada or Israel or the United States. We should do everything we can to help the Ukrainians. They're fighting the Battle of Britain. I love history, and I remember when Britain was all alone, between 1939 and when the Americans entered the war. The Commonwealth was all alone. My father joined the army. He wasn't drafted. He joined the army to help, not Britain, to help the world. So it's about altruism again. War is too big a subject for me to be able to handle, except to say there are things one can do. I guess that's you should not throw up your hands and say, well, all I can do is give money. Money helps. Money does help. We don't give enough money. And you can write to your parliamentarian and say the Canadian government's doing great. They should do more. In Israel, shamefully, our government, while we've helped the Ukrainians, hasn't come out and publicly chastised the Russians. I know why they haven't. There's good reasons on our side for that, for our own security, but it's wrong. And so in my own context, I fight that fight too. I haven't won it yet, but there are things one can do. And I think my Ethiopian colleagues in Mekelle could probably tell you more about how the efforts we made on their behalf, at the very least, helped their morale, if nothing more.
I think one of the challenges that many of us experience is that the latest, war receives a great deal of attention, as appropriately it should. But, there is there is an invisibility about those older people and civilians in Sudan, in
Right.
Somalia, in
You're right.
Rwanda.
You're right. You're right.
It seems as though, you know, those wars that continue seem to get, you know, down and down on the ladder of attention. And I think as civil society, we have a responsibility, you know, to continue to learn and put those
Right.
issues on the agenda.
Yeah, I agree that. So when I teach the master's program at the Hebrew University for the mid-career doctors from sub-Saharan Africa, many of whom work in exactly the places you mentioned, the DRC, the refugee camps in Uganda, refugee camps in Ethiopia. That little universe of people that I teach, they now know something more about old people, and they've told me they're going to go back energized to look after children and women and, you know, babies and stuff. But they're not going to walk around. I hope they're not going to walk around that old person in a refugee camp. And I think that organizations like the IFA are instrumental, critically important. And the reason I'm speaking today is simply because I opened my big mouth after John Beard gave a really good talk a few weeks ago. And I wrote to John and Jane. I said it was really inspiring because John's an inspiring guy. And I really enjoyed that session. I said, but, you know, you guys, for the most part, we're talking about the rich world. And you and Jane, to your credit, you said, well, you know what? Come on, let's talk about the poor world. And John's done lots of stuff for the poor world. This isn't a criticism of him or the WHO, but there's a lot of work to do. And there's a lot of old people in the world, and most of them are in poor countries. That's my message to anybody. And my friends in Ethiopia deserve a huge amount of credit because they are one of the poorest countries in the world, and they've written this national plan, and they're going to do something. What exactly remains to be seen, but they're not ignoring it. The Ministry of Health of Ethiopia is not ignoring this problem, and that's very unusual for an LMIC, I think, and I think it's very laudable.
Well, Mark, we're coming to a close now, but I do want to acknowledge Dr. Michael Gordon, who's with us today, and many other colleagues, not only in Canada, but around the world, and particularly to your colleague in Ethiopia and probably several others, but particularly Abiet Tantu. And I would ask everybody to take down Abi's email address as he has given it to us and show support by learning more about what's going on in Ethiopia. And who knows, we may have our next global conference somewhere in Africa and shine a light on that region.
Great, that's a great idea. That's a terrific.
Well, I think that I will just inform the board that that's where we need to go.
I'll be happy to come show up. That'll be great. And they'll welcome you. I know they will.
Well, I think it really is time, you know, to be present and not do, but learn from those, you know, in Africa. So we hope to do that.
Right.
But as we come to a close, Mark, you know, this really has been a journey for me and us today, you know, and we've dipped into so many different aspects of your life, your career, your experiences, you know, and your opinions, and all of those give us richness to take away today and into the future. And in bringing this to close, I want to thank everybody for being with us today. There will be a Global Cafe next week. We're really hoping to hear from Dr. Krishna Gautam from Aging Nepal about the work in Nepal. And we will come back to you with all of the details. But Mark, can you give us some takeaway messages that we can take, you know, the tangible work that we take forward? What would you be saying to us?
Well, I guess I'd like to quote Betty Davis, who said, "Old age ain't no place for sissies."
Well, don't we all know that? But
and there's a lot. And that being said, there's a lot. I'm speaking to the converted, I'm sure, on this screen, but there is so much we can do for old people, even with limited resources. There's a lot that can be done to help them. And we're gonna be old one day too, if we're not already. So it sort of behooves us. It's self-interest to do this as well, because if you don't die prematurely, you might need some help one day. The better the services are that we plan today, the better we'll be looked after tomorrow.
And I think one thing that we've all got is good faith and willingness to cooperate, to partner, to be with one another moving forward through our individual journey, but the collective journey to protect and respect the rights of older people and to help improve the services at a country level. So Dr. Mark Clarfield, thank you very much for being
Thank
with
you.
us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, and to all of you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Be well.